the least we can do. You know, when you were growing up in a family, remember your parents used to tell you, if I don't teach you nothing else, at least I'm going to teach you this. And so everybody had a standard. Everybody had a bottom line that if you didn't know nothing else, you were going to know this. Well, that's what the Common Core is. If you don't know nothing else, you got to know this in order to be able to succeed. And we know that children who do not establish an appreciation and love of education, who do not get a good foundation in pre-K and K, struggle the rest of their educational life.
How did you get engaged in this industry? How did you stay in this industry? And what can people do to get in it?
Okay, so if I'm to be honest, you know, I didn't choose this industry, and I told this story 2 days ago. I wanted to do fashion advertising. That is what I studied, and that's what I wanted to do. And I got 2 job offers, one from the gas company down the street, and one from a big design house in New York City. And when I did the math, I decided I was going to work at the gas company because I was going and I got engaged in the industry, and I stayed really, quite frankly, because of M.O.V.E. Because the association allowed me to understand how what my job was tied to everybody else in the industry. And that's what made it interesting, because all of a sudden now I understood, you know, when I was talking with a customer and we shut them off and I had to negotiate how I was going to get them back on and all this other stuff, why all that stuff mattered to my company, to the community, how those things were tied together, and being able to meet people in this industry who had different roles, who could teach me about what they were doing and how those things were connected, is really what made me passionate.
Yeah, I agree with Paula. Our industry, I used to think of myself as a nerd because I found it so interesting, but it's absolutely phenomenal. At the beginning of this, the 20th century, all the engineers gathered together, the Association of Engineers, and they had a whole list of changes that had impacted the last century. And they voted. And guess what made it to the very top? Electricity. It is the number one, natural, whatever, not natural, it's number one wonder of this century. The fact that we electrify the country and the fact that we have access to the things that Paula is talking about. We have not done a good job. We do not sell a product. We sell a lifestyle. And in many cases, we sell life and death. I had the opportunity to speak to a university audience, and I told them at the beginning of, I think it was in March or so, and I said, listen, the product that we deliver is so pivotal. When you walk into my son just graduated, and I just moved him into his first apartment. When we walked into that apartment, he flicked on the switch, and guess what? He expected the light to come on. There was no doubt whatsoever in his mind that that light was going to come on. Now, if we had to wait for my son to graduate, for us to build a plant that would power the house and the apartment where he lived, it would take 3 years for him to be in darkness. At the minimum of 3 years, that he will have no light. But this industry anticipates that. We look at the demographic, we look at who is going where, who is graduating where. We plan for that. And that is why our industry is unique. We are the only industry that has a product called capacity. No other industry has that, because you consume electricity the same time that you produce it. We don't store electricity, not yet. So when we walked into that apartment and flipped on the switch, somebody somewhere had to have a generator that kicked in to supply that power. Can you imagine that? That is amazing. And that is what this industry delivers. We haven't told the story. What I told them at that university is the price of a simple cup of coffee from Starbucks is how much it takes to power your house in one day. Think about that. How many cups of Starbucks do you drink? And that is how much? $3 to power your house for an entire day. And still customers do not get it. Some customers complain about the pricing. So again, there is a shared responsibility here. Some of the responsibility we own as an industry, we haven't done a good job of breaking it down, helping people understand it. In fact, some customers think that we are the government or subsidized by the government, and we're not. We're just a private enterprise like everybody else. So we need to do a better job, and I totally agree with Paula to package the story and message it right so that customers understand what we do.
Nobody ever thinks about the light company or the gas company or a gas station until there's a storm and you can't charge your phone and you can't do the things that you're used to doing every day, and then they become the most important people in your life. And so I think for the sector, we have certainly not done a good job of encouraging people to use this as a career pathway. But the sector is so very broad, so when you look at the energy sector, you're talking about transportation, you're talking about electricity, you're talking about home heating oil and fuel, you're talking about renewables, you're talking about such a broad base of an industry that sometimes it's just hard to wrap your arms around it. And in my role, what's I think particularly frustrating is this idea that we're not interesting or innovative. Because we absolutely are, and if anyone had to think about how you create an electron that goes through a wire, that allows you to turn on a switch, that lets you plug in your toaster, there had to have been a whole lot of innovation to kind of make that happen. And yet we'll say it's boring. But, absolutely, it's impossible to be boring, and it's got to be extremely creative. And so, I have a son who is studying, he's a computer science major because he wants to make video games. And I'm trying to explain to this child that video game designers make, on average, $10 to $12 an hour. And that he should look at cybersecurity. And his thing is like, but that doesn't seem interesting. And so I'm trying to explain to him, but think about being the guy who prevents somebody from hacking into a system that could shut down our grid. And how interesting and how you have to do that. And I think so it's how we tell the story about the work that we do.
Thank you, and again, thank you to NOBEL for the leadership role that you have played, particularly in your partnership with NBCSL in helping educate the African American community nationwide about the need for discussion of more broadband. And just let me compliment one other person, Nicole, your boss, David, for all the work that you've done with the Minority Telecommunications Council. It's been fabulous. And I'm kind to myself, I realize I'm wasting, it's not a waste of my time because I appreciate the role these folks have played and the role that President Smyrie and President Ballard have played with keeping NBCSL at the forefront with discussing how important broadband access is. I really appreciate it. Now, and I've taken 45 of my seconds. I'll be quick on AT&T for this reason. We do a lot. I'll tell you about one program. The president called us all, as Deb said, to the White House, and in February we made a $100 million commitment to the Connect Ed program to provide 50,000 middle and high school students in Title I schools free internet connectivity. And again, because 10 years ago we had the discussion about the need for it, and more of you as legislators, as we've had discussions at the state level, began to use the word necessity. It is now a necessity, and it is. However, we still, as the president pointed out in February, it's only 33% of high schools now really have digital learning, and that's part of the reason not only we made the commitment. Again, Dale mentioned Verizon's $100 million. I know Comcast, Time Warner, I'm sure Bright House also made significant commitments. Overall, $750 million commitment, and that's really not enough. Now, let me mention one other thing in this part, because I know there are probably several other questions we want to get to, and I just want to put this in the scope of what is at risk. Back in 2009, just very briefly, the Congress gave the FCC a mandate to study broadband, and they came up with a study, and they said what we need is $350 billion to make broadband ubiquitous or universal. And the stimulus plan provided, you all may remember, $7 billion. You don't have to be a mathematician to say that's less than 2% of what the FCC said is needed. So it is the private sector that has to find a way to make those investments. And again, as a whole, up here, the companies represented at this table, we invest over $50 billion, that's undisputed, a year in the infrastructure. The question is, how do we and how do you as legislatures position us to invest more? And again, we'll get back to that, Dr. Turner-Lee, but I kind of wanted to mention that because part of that is very important to closing the
Deborah, let's talk about investment. I know I've heard from you several statistics about the level of investment, and we've heard some numbers thrown out. What is it are we seeing in terms of how the broadband industry is contributing to the growth of the national economy? Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. As Cleo mentioned, the broadband industry is investing about $50 billion each year. And Tony also mentioned that since 1996, the broadband industry has invested $1.2 trillion, that's trillion with a T, dollars. And that is, the industry has invested more in the U.S. infrastructure than the U.S. has spent on building infrastructure in highways, railroads, and airports. And we've spent more in building out the infrastructure than the U.S. spent in sending a man to the moon. And because of this investment, communications and technology sector supports nearly 100 million American jobs. And commerce transactions completed via mobile phones and tablets are expected to rise to $114 billion in 2014. That's folks shopping online. And for every dollar invested in wireless broadband, it will create $7 to $10 in the U.S. GDP. Not only is broadband just driving the U.S. economy, consumers cannot live without their technology. There was a study, first of all, let me ask folks in here, how many of you can live without the internet for a year?
A year?
I'm having a problem with my connection right now.
My pastor asked us to go without social media for 30 days. It hurt.
So, I found this study online. BCG researcher conducted a study and asked internet users about whether or not they can go without internet for a year. 83% of Americans said they would give up fast food before they give up their internet for a year. 77% said they would give up chocolate. 73% said they would give up alcohol. 63% said they'd give up coffee. 43% said they'd give up exercise. 21% said that they'll give up and 7% said they would give up taking a shower.
Did anybody took that? Let me tweet this, ladies. Hold that. Let me tweet this. You got this NOBEL women won.
So yes, the internet is very important to driving the economy and for consumers.
Providing low-income families access to low-price broadband as well as low-price computer equipment. What we also have learned in our relationships with our school districts is sometimes it's not just about the access, it really is about closing the digital divide in terms of relevance. And so when you look at why some people don't adopt, it's not always because they can't afford it. Sometimes they just don't know what to do with it. If you get a minute, in the back of the room, I left this little infographic. I did not create it. The source is down here and annotated. But what's interesting is 91% of teachers in classrooms say that they actually have access to computers and things they need. But still, 1 in 5 of them say they don't have access to the actual technology. So we're trying to help in another way to bring relevance to the digital technology. And one of the programs we're launching is a project-based program that teachers can work with students in their classroom on. We're also looking for community partners to be institutes for us to help students stand up projects that will help not only drive digital adoption and technology, but entrepreneurial skills.
First thing I want to say is, I'm a son of the South. I know that that's a difficult thing for some people. When you're from the South, they think you're backwards, you're slow, you're country bumpkin. There's a lot of misnomers and a a lot of derogatory things they say about the South. And then we have some Southern folk, white folk who give us a bad name. And so when you go put all that together, it's hard sometimes to say you're from the South, but I'm from the South. And part of the reason for voting rights and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, and specifically, was to give minorities in the United States the real right to vote. Right? So if you look at a state like Mississippi in 1964, there were over 400,000 African Americans who did not have a right to vote in Mississippi. And the question was, how do we get there? Right? How do we get there? How do we get that right to vote? That should have been a part of the amendments, right? 13, 14, and 15 amendments to the Constitution. I know that the only amendment that some folks can recognize as an amendment is the Second Amendment. If you ain't got no gun, you ain't got no rights. And so that's the only thing that folks want to talk about is the Second Amendment. Right? And if you don't believe in the Second Amendment, you ain't a constitutionalist. My argument is that if you don't believe in one of them, and you got 31, 36, 37 now, then you're in a pretty bad place, right? You need to recognize all of them as a part of the process. And so the failure to recognize the 13, 14, and 15 Amendment gave us this position where we needed to come forward with a Voting Rights Act that said we wanted to make sure that minorities in this country had a right to vote. And the Summer Project in 1964 in Mississippi was one of those watershed moments that led us to the Voting Rights Act. And the civil rights leaders working together to force and work with President Johnson to make that happen. And it was in that there was 18 full and partial states that had Section 5. And Section 4 was the preemptive piece to make Section 5 real. And Section 4 was the one that said, here's these 18 all and part states that had to have it. So all of the South had to have a Voting Rights Act to make sure that its citizens could vote. So all of the southern states are fully inside of what was Section 4 to make Section 5. And Section 5 was pre-clearance, meaning that if you were part of these bad states, these states who didn't believe in voting rights for minorities and for black folks in particular, then you needed to have a federal declaration to make that possible. And in this federal declaration to make that possible was the Voting Rights Act. And so all of our states fully, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, we got some other names for them, like Louisiana and North Carolina and South Carolina, but they're still the same things. And so this historical process is that it was inside of the fight for voting rights that led to a national process. And see, parts of New York, parts of California, all those are part of places where minorities needed to have a Voting Rights Act to be able to become fully engaged as full citizens of this country. Right? Now we have a Supreme Court who's saying that's unfair to white folk.
I like this conversation about the necessity of the Section 5 protections and how Section 4 really provided Section 5 provided teeth for Section 4. So I want to move over to Ms. Yasmin. And Yasmin, maybe you can help us understand the real on the ground implications of what Section 5 did, how it protected the right to vote for people of color and other minorities.
A good example of that would be, not Canton, what's this other suburb of Jackson? No, I guess it's a city right next to Clinton. Clinton, Mississippi is a good example. So in 2011, Clinton, Mississippi was about 44% African American, but had no district drawn for them. where they can actually elect their own elected officials, city council-wide. And so Section 4 and 5 were used in order for them to get that seat. So currently in Clinton, Mississippi, there is a seat where African Americans can elect their own legislator because of that, the Section 4 and Section 5 protections. There's currently a federal legislation that some of you guys are probably aware of where they're trying to push to get additional coverage, and only the city would be covered under that formula. So we are at a time right now where we need to be very proactive on our national front to make sure that we can come up with a formula that makes sense for folks to be able to support and galvanize around. You know, I know the Supreme Court quite didn't say that they didn't want minorities to vote, but what they said was the formula was inaccurate. And so we've got to be very careful when we use these technical terms that we use, you know, that we actually articulate them properly. We're talking about the Supreme Court, and it's a very big deal that they're saying that coverage, that we were doing business by looking at certain numbers, were not good enough anymore, right? And that every year, over time, Congress had just been reauthorizing that bill without actually looking at stuff. And so that's another good example of us being proactive, I guess, in that movement forward to be able to identify that. But on the ground, I mean, we're talking about voter ID mostly here in Mississippi, and how I wanted to make I wanted to have a point of reference just for a moment, because I brought one of my young people with me who's actually on the